Boldwood presents Raven Lord, written by J.C. Duncan and read by Sean Barrett. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Preface. When Harald Sigurdsson sailed south from Kyiv in 1034, he was still just a 19-year-old man. But despite his youth, he was already a famed mercenary, having been promoted, however briefly, to command the personal guard of Grand Prince Yaroslav of the Kyivan Rus. That was a position he achieved not only through his personal connections, as they were related by marriage, but also by success on the battlefield and, presumably, no shortage of the power of personality he would become so famous for. At the end of the previous book, Warrior Prince, Harald had made the difficult decision not to return to his home in Norway to seek the crown. It was clear to him that the child Magnus, the illegitimate son of his beloved half-brother and deposed King of Norway, Olaf, was going to be installed on the throne by a powerful coalition of Norwegian nobles and their Danish overlords. This was a bitter pill to swallow for Harald, whose single driving ambition was to regain his brother's throne. But with just a couple of hundred men and no allies, he had no chance of winning a conflict with the puppet masters behind the new boy king. So Harald instead sailed south, headed for the one place that all Norse fighting men knew fame and glory could be earned in unparalleled measure: Constantinople, the city that they called Miklagard, which quite simply meant the Great City. And great it was. It was undoubtedly the greatest and richest city in Europe at the time. The empire was at the apex of a renewal of sorts, driven by 100 years of military and political reorganization and success. The empire needed soldiers, and with a relatively small loyal population of Greeks and Romans, it hired mercenaries by the shipload. Of all the mercenaries available, the Norsemen, the ones who the Greeks called Varangians, were the most highly sought after, and those that survived imperial service would often return home as very wealthy and famous men. Varangian means sworn companion, and in the empire the reputation of the Norse as both supreme fighters and as men who could be trusted to keep their word was what made them so valuable. In the 10th century, the emperors started preferring the Varangian Guard Company, Tagma, over even the elite Roman cavalry units, and they became the personal guard of the emperors, both at home and on the battlefield, earning themselves a fearsome and enduring reputation. Harald has another reason for heading south, too, a reason that drives many powerful. His fall from grace in Kyiv was driven by his conflict with the Greek noblewoman Maria, who he had loved and who had cast him aside when he was no longer useful, and her mercenary captain, Bardas. Maria and Bardas were part of the great game of power around the imperial throne, trying to maneuver themselves into position to choose who ruled the empire. Maria's patron, Theodora, her sister, Empress Zoe, and the new emperor, Michael, were part of three great rival factions, each of which were trying to manipulate and murder their way into sole power over the fabulously wealthy but fundamentally unstable empire. The previous emperor died with the empire precariously balanced and divided, and in the political fallout from his succession, the swirl of plots, murders, and intrigue that Harald will find himself entwined in will give him both a new swath of opportunities and a fearsome array of threats. To have any hope of returning home to rule Norway, he must first not only survive his time in the east, but prosper there. War and political conflict are descending on the empire, even as Harald's ships sail into the Black Sea. Harald is about to enter the great game of Roman imperial power, the real Game of Thrones. With a little luck and a great deal of bloodshed, he might just become the perfect player. Part 1. Guardsman. Chapter 1. Nidaros, Norway, Spring 1098 A.D. "I don't want to miss him start," Ingvar said, glowering at Jarl Hakon as his father fussed over the remainder of his evening meal. "It is early. It is not even growing dark yet. The hall will be empty, and we will look the fools for rushing to it." Ingvar snorted contemptuously, his plate long since emptied and abandoned. fidgeting with impatience and constantly turning to look at the flap of their shared tent, as if he could see past it and across the fields to the great hall of Tinghaugen, where Eric, the follower, had promised he would continue his tale of his life with King Harald Sigurdsson, the Hardrada. Håkon was amused by Ingvar's roused spirit. The boy had not stopped talking about Harald Hardrada since the previous evening, when they had heard the tale of Harald's adventures and achievements in the Kyivan Rus. The boy was 16 years old, and thus, like many of his age, usually slow to accept counsel and difficult to engage with. Håkon was taking him to the Frostating and the proposed spring campaign to the Southern Isles, in no small part to try and draw from the boy the spirit and temperament needed to be a leader, to be able to take over their family lands and his position as a jarl when the time came. King Magnus was expected to arrive in 3 days, and would spend the time before the Frostating gathering support. Håkon knew he would support the king already, and needed no convincing. He had his own reasons for going, one last campaign before he was too old, but primarily he was going so that he could take his son and let the boy earn his manhood in the old ways. Ingvar had aggression and confidence, but in wisdom and understanding he was lacking. Håkon would have paid a fistful of silver to have the boy sit for a few nights and listen intently to older, wiser men and learn from them. It amused him that now he would not have to. Not only that, but he was sure the headstrong boy would have refused if the idea had come from his father. Finally, still hiding his smile to avoid pricking Ingvar's pride, he finished off his meal and held up his hands in submission. "Fine, boy. Let us go." Ingvar shot to his feet with a nod and was out of the tent before his father had finished rising. They walked briskly through the fields, past the few tents of the men who had arrived for the Frostating before them, and into the town proper, weaving down the narrow streets and past the low, thatched houses of the year-round residents. Finally they reached the central ring and the imposing hall of the Lord of Tinghaugen, where King Magnus would hold court in 3 days' time. Håkon saw to his surprise that the great door was open, and as they walked towards it, they could see men already gathered within. "I told you," said Ingvar with a spiteful look. "You say a great many things with confidence, my boy. Occasionally you will be right," Håkon said with a relaxed smile, although internally he felt a prick of annoyance, hoping that Eric had not already begun his tale. As they went through the door, his eyebrows rose, and he saw that the tables were already half full, with men sitting on some of the chests and benches that lined the walls. He was stunned. Everyone in the room was focused on a single table in the centre, where Håkon's old friend, Jarl Torvald, sat next to the wizened figure of Erik Sveitunger, the old companion of the long-dead King of Norway, Harald Hardrada. "We are too late for a seat close by," hissed Ingvar in anger, his fists balling, not even looking at his father. At that moment, as Håkon mumbled an apology, Jarl Torvald pointed at them, and Erik slowly twisted his head around, his bushy white brows rising as he set eyes on Ingvar and Håkon. There was a moment's pause, and then Erik waved a thin hand, beckoning them to the bench beside him and another man shuffling along to make space. Håkon felt suddenly exposed, with many of the gathered men looking at him as the old man, as if a close acquaintance, invited him to sit from across the hall. He followed his son before, bewildered, he took the proffered seat at the central table. Torvald grinned and reached across the table to grasp Håkon's hand, and then Ingvar's. "We weren't sure you were coming. I was just telling Erik to start without you." Ingvar looked abashed and mumbled an excuse, while Håkon just looked confused. "You were waiting for us?" Erik's lined face cracked into a sly smile, and he looked at Ingvar with his bright, piercing stare. "It was you that asked me to tell you the tale of Harald, was it not?" "Yes, Erik." "Well, I said I would do so, and I am a man of my word, famously so." He gestured around the room and then pointed a skinny finger at the boy. "These other men are most welcome to listen if they wish, but I am no court skald to entertain them, and I am telling the story to you." Ingvar flushed with pleasure at the honour the old man was paying him, and couldn't stop himself from grinning, even as Torvald laughed. Eric took a languid sip from the horn mug of ale that sat on the table in front of him, and sat up, coughing, and cleared his throat. Someone called for silence in the audience near them, and Eric looked around with a nod of thanks as the room fell into an expectant quiet. Eric stretched his hands out in front of him, fixing Ingvar with a stern gaze. "Now, I believe we had just arrived in the empire of the Greeks, who call themselves the Romans. Well, it was late in summer in the year of our Lord, 1034, and we had just sailed down the Dnieper from Kyiv in 2 ships, Harald as our leader, with 130 men and all the riches we had earned in the service of Grand Prince Yaroslav. We had nothing else but our weapons and our skill to offer. It was not an exciting journey. The Black Sea is famous for its pirates, but we looked like warships, and none dared bother us. We reached the Bosporus, the great narrows that divide the Black Sea from the Propontis south of Constantinople, and we lowered our sails and rowed until we came into sight of the great city itself. We had thought Kyiv was magnificent, that white city on its hill above the great Dnieper river. But as the Lord is my witness, Constantinople, the heart of the empire of the Greeks, is the most magnificent sight I have ever seen, or ever will. It is vast. I have never seen Rome itself, and some say its ruins are larger and more magnificent still, but the city of Constantine is a marvel of the spirit and industry of men, impossible to understand for one who has lived there. The whole city is surrounded by magnificent stone walls of layered grey stone and red bricks, studded with towers like a necklace with beads. On the landward side the wall has 2 rings and great citadels at each corner, but even the seaward side is enclosed. The towers and domes of the churches crown the hills and line the sky above the city, looming over the great palaces and the houses of the people alike. They say 500,000 people live in the city, half within its great walls alone. That is more people than live in all of Norway, perhaps more than live in the lands of our brethren, the Swedes, in one city. And it is a city of the water, surrounded by it on 3 sides, the hub of an empire that rules by trade and by might, all transferred across the sea. There are so many ships coming to and fro that the city has 3 great harbours, each of which would be the pride of any of our biggest towns, and several smaller ones besides. And this is the sight that greeted us, our band of northern mercenaries and exiles, as we sailed into the narrow waters of the Golden Horn, the inlet that ran along one side of the city, mouths agape and eyes wide like the full moon. This was the empire we had come to fight for, so immeasurably richer than wealthy Kyiv, which we had just left. Because that is what we were thinking about when we saw all of that. We were not men looking for a home. We were not here to admire beauty or gaze upon fine wonders of building. No, we were men in search of silver in exchange for our service, and this city exuded wealth in every aspect. We could only imagine what its people and rulers would pay to protect what they had built. We were seeking to join the service of the new emperor, Michael IV, who had risen to the throne a few months before, to join the famed mercenary guard, the Varangians, who only accepted battle-tested men of northern blood. Legendary in battle, and for the wealth and fame they could earn, Harald believed that through service in their ranks he could earn enough fame and fortune to return to Norway and claim the throne. "Rolf, come to me," said Harald, as he stood in the bow of the ship where we were standing, drinking in the sight of the city. For a while I was still spellbound at the sight of it. Harald was already thinking ahead to what we must do. Rolf, who we called Hammerbeard for his long grey beard, thick on his cheeks but dangling low from his chin, looking like the old pagan symbol of Thor's hammer, had joined us in Kyiv before the battle with the Pecheneges. He was already an old man by our standards. A lifelong mercenary and as tough a soldier who ever lived, he had been in the service of Emperor and had left with a small fortune in 1025 when the emperor died. In less than 5 years, Rolf had spent the riches he'd earned in the service of the empire, frittered it away on women and wine and good living, until he had been forced to seek service once again, this time with Yaroslav, and after that with Harald. We mocked him for his profligacy, his age, and his ridiculous beard, but Harald valued him highly for his experience, his fearsome skill in battle, and, in particular, his knowledge of the empire we sought to serve. He was also, critically, the only man in our party who could properly speak the language of the Greeks. He had spent much of the journey from Kyiv telling Harald everything he could about the city and the empire. Rolf came up to stand next to Harald, who pointed at the shore before us, where a series of grand terraced buildings rose up to the crown of the promontory overlooking the Narrows. "That is the palace?" "Yes, and the great cathedral called the Hagia Sophia, which means the Church of the Holy Wisdom, beside it." "And how did we get there?" "When we enter the Golden Horn, there will be 2 harbours on the palace shore. The first is for royal use only, the second for trade and visitors from the north. We will go to the second and announce ourselves." "Good, you will do that." "Of course." "Will there be trouble arriving with so many armed men?" asked Harald. "No, the harbour is walled, manned day and night by the Vigla or the Numoroi. We will only be allowed in if they choose so, and we pose no threat if they choose not to allow it." "Ah, yes. Who are the Vigla, you wonder?" "Well, they are one of the many units of guards, like a herd, but more organized, professional soldiers. Look, for us simple Northmen, this is all very confusing and complicated. Here, the king has his herd, and they protect him and fight with him on campaign. But the Greek emperor then had 5 main companies of guards, which they called tagmata. Each tagma had different duties, each guarded against a different threat or treachery. It is complex, but you will learn more as I speak of our time there." "But they will allow us in?" Harald asked. Rolf shrugged. "I cannot be sure, but they have no reason not to. The emperors are always seeking new Varangians, especially after ascension to the throne, when they need to secure their position with strength." Harald nodded and fell silent, but I could see that he was still nervous. We turned into the inlet of the Golden Horn, a dozen or so other ships of various sizes coming and going from its broad mouth. Rolf nodded his head at the great stone bastion on the southern bank, where the inlet narrowed, and then "That is where the chain is raised during times of war, or to protect the harbour from raiders." "A chain that stretches across this whole river? How is that possible?" I said, like the ignorant that I was. "You will see," said Rolf, with a knowing smile. Well, as we drew closer, I could indeed see with my own eyes what would have defied any attempt to explain. A long chain of iron, slender enough at a distance to look like rope, but close up, visibly a string of long iron loops hung from the towers on each side. The chain draped over a series of anchored log rafts, holding its weight above the surface. Between the 2 central rafts, covering the greatest span of perhaps 50 paces, the chain sank beneath the waters. Rolf saw me staring at it in wonder. In the towers, the ends are connected to great windlasses that can be manned by 50 men. When they turn, the chain shortens, and the span in the centre rises high enough to prevent passage by ships. "That is extraordinary," I said, for it was. Even to this day I find it remarkable that man is capable of such feats of forging a chain of such length. It must have weighed as much as 1,000 men, using more iron than an army would carry into battle. Well, we passed over the gap in that monstrous chain, watched silently by 2 guard ships, small dromons in the Greek style. They are completely unlike our ships, tall, thick, heavy ships with 2 layers of oars and a small sail. Ponderous under sail, but lethal under oars, almost as quick as a good longship, despite their weight. The guard ships were small and nimble, but the big ships of the Imperial Navy, docked on the southern side of the city, could be twice as large as our ships and carry 200 men apiece. Rolf directed us into the harbour, bustling with activity on that late summer day, and a well-dressed man in a small boat shouted at us and directed us to an empty berth near the shipbuilding sheds on the southern side. There, waiting for us when we pulled alongside and shipped our oars, were a dozen bored-looking guards, eyeing us Norsemen blankly. "Men of the city watch, the Numeroi," murmured Rolf, "not Vigla." "Is that good or bad?" asked Harald quietly. "Good. They can probably be bribed if we have problems." "And the Vigla?" "Never try and bribe a Vigla guardsman. They are the palace guards. They are paid too much to accept bribes, and rewarded handsomely for handing over those who try and corrupt them." Harald nodded at that slowly. "I will remember that. Just say I am Harald Nordbricht, a Norwegian mercenary, here with my men to join the Varangians." Rolf nodded and waved to the man standing at the head of the guards and shouted cheerily to him in Greek, pointing at us and our men and presumably explaining who we were. There was a short exchange, and the guard waved Rolf onto the quay. "We can go, 4 of us. The rest stay here with the ships until we get permission to go into the city." "4?" asked Harald, taken aback. "They aren't going to let 100 unknown armed men into the city. They don't have the authority. We need sealed orders from one of the guard commanders." "How do we get those?" asked Harald in annoyance. "He will take us to the Varangian barracks, for a price. The commander will decide if he wants to take us on." Harald sighed, clearly annoyed with the process. He would have to get used to it. The empire of the Romans ran on a never-ending web of officials and permissions and seals. No, I tell a lie. He never got used to it. Harald spent his entire time there trying to break the system rather than bow down to it, and in some cases succeeded. Harald looked around at us and nodded at me and Afra, the bandit, before disembarking onto the stone quay. I rolled my eyes at Afra, who smirked in reply. It was always our lot to be with Harald for any problems like this. We were the ones he trusted and used to take care of things he could not, or would rather not, take care of himself. "Haraldor, Wulfr, you're in charge until I return. Leave half the men in the ships, rest the others on the dock. Don't let anyone aboard or interfere with our cargo." Wulfr looked at the clutch of guards who still lingered on the shore. "And if they insist? Don't use violence, but make it clear they are not welcome. Push off and wait out in the Narrows if you have to. Eric, Afra, come." I did not envy Wulfr and Haraldor their task. They did not speak Greek, and they would have no idea when we were returning. But they were capable men, cousins from Iceland, who had been with us since the campaign to the Kyivan towns in Poland 2 years before. We followed the guard along the beaten earth track behind the docks towards the city wall. It was imposing, even on the waterside, where it was just a single wall. The Romans had built it tall and thick, and I had seen nothing like it before. It was already old, hundreds of years old, and plants grew in the cracks between stones, and some of the bricks were starting to crumble. But it still looked strong. We were taken through a broad, brick-lined gate. Its thick wooden doors were propped open, men and carts queuing to pass through in both directions, carrying all manner of goods. This was the main gate from the northern harbours, and on the other side the space opened up to reveal a line of large, low buildings, storehouses for goods and wares that were coming in and out of the harbour. While I gazed in awe at their scale, the guard ignored them and set off directly along the stone-surfaced street, up the gentle hill, into the city. "This is where all the foreigners and northern merchants live," said Rolf as we passed blocks of strange houses, 2 or 3 or even 4 floors high, crowded together like stone hay bales in a way I had never seen before. I assumed we were on the main street of the city, so well was it paved and adorned. But soon we turned off onto another, greater street, wide enough for 2 carts to pass. In moments we had passed 2 churches that would have been the pride of any Norwegian town, and I could not believe what I was seeing. Then we crested the hill and came out from behind a large building, a palace maybe, and that is when I saw the Church of the Holy Wisdom for the first time. How can I describe it to you, you who have not seen it with your own eyes? It is a mountain of man-made stone, vast in its every detail. It is magnificent beyond description. My mouth is incapable of relating to you the sheer size and splendor my eyes beheld. And it is 500 years old, so they told us. And it was no lie, because you could see its age in the stones and the discoloration and the crumbling of its details. But yet, despite its age being older than any Norse nation, older than any building in all the north, it was still beautiful and breathtaking. By the Lord, how we think ourselves superior and how wrong we are. The Romans were building marvels like this before our kin were placing one stone upon another up to the height of a man and covering it with branches to shelter from the snows. And all that work in building is dedicated to the glory of God and his wisdom. It took the breath from my throat, friends, and I looked to my left and was surprised to see Harald staring, mouth agape like a child. Harald, who never showed a care. He looked at me with wide eyes. I could never imagine such a wonder. How can men build such things? Said Afra with a devout whisper. I had no idea such a place even existed. Come, said Rolf with a soft smile. There are many more wonders to see, and our escort does not appear to want to wait while we look upon them. I tore my eyes from the gargantuan building and its myriad domes, and saw the guardsmen standing impatiently at the edge of a long, broad square that lay alongside the great church, waving at us like we were wayward children. I cannot tell you, it changed my life forever to see such things that men were capable of in the rest of the world. I love our country, the land of my kin. I love our little fjords and towns, and even this fine wooden hall. But let me tell you, with no insult, we are big people in such small houses compared to the Greeks. They might be small and strange to our eyes, but they build with the hands of giants and the vision of heaven. Chapter 2. The Chark Gate, said Rolf, as we reached the end of the great square outside the church and were met with an enormous gatehouse, fronted with shining bronze gates 3 times the height of a man. A wonder all to themselves, standing almost unnoticed in a city of wonders. On our right, above the roof of a series of low-domed buildings, a huge construction loomed. A wall of stone arches and niches, richly decorated with statues and banners. I did not know it then, but it was the Hippodrome, an arena for the racing of chariots, with space inside for tens of thousands of citizens to watch and be entertained, although all I could see at the time was the vast outer wall of one end. The guards stopped to talk to the men standing watch there. These guards were different, I could tell from their uniform and equipment. They were not Greek, for one thing. I could see immediately there was a pair of northerners there, and perhaps some Rus or Bulgars. They were taller, fairer-skinned, and magnificently equipped. Vigla guardsmen, said Rolf. This is the boundary of the palace grounds. The Vigla are the Emperor's watchmen and guard the perimeter of the palace, or his camp when he is outside the city, and control at all times who gets within sight of the Emperor. I thought the Varangians were the Emperor's guard, I said. The Varangians are his bodyguard in battle and his might when he is absent. Combat troops, mainly, replied Rolf. Good, muttered Harald. I did not come here to guard a palace again. The contempt in his voice was clear. They are not mere city watch, Harald. They are mercenaries also, many with years of battle experience. They are underestimated at their enemy's peril, good at what they do. No match for the Varangians, of course, but for almost anyone else. Harald grunted at that, clearly not impressed. Neither was I. In my experience, watchmen made poor soldiers, more used to bullying tradesmen and chasing thieves than fighting real warriors. Well, our arrogance was misplaced. We would spend years guarding the palace, more time than we spent at war. That is the Varangian life. The guard we had followed finished his conversation. "We are allowed through to the Varangian barracks," he said to us with a satisfied smile. "How many more men will we have to pass through?" asked Harald in annoyance. "Oh, a few, I expect. It has gone unusually well so far," replied Rolf brightly. The guard passed us off to 4 Vigla guardsmen, who stared us down with something bordering on hostility, and formed up around us to march us, almost like prisoners, through the massive and ornate gateway that led into the palace compound. We passed immediately from the crowded city streets into a lush garden. A tree-lined path led off to our right along the hilltop, with great red-tiled halls, churches, and cloistered porticos scattered along both sides. We walked a short distance past the gate until we reached a squat stone building, 2 stories high and broad, with a tiled hall at one corner. The Vigla guardsmen went to the large double gate and spoke to 2 mailed warriors standing there. "Varangians," said Rolf with almost a sigh of pleasure. I looked at the warriors with interest, because uniquely among the men we had seen so far in the city, they looked much like us, except dressed more finely. Their mail armour was trimmed with woven patterns, their cloaks dyed bright colours, and the rims of their helmets lined with riveted bronze. They both carried long axes, unadorned battlefield weapons, with swords sheathed at their sides. I could see the glint of gold and silver on their wrists and at their necks, and they both had full, well-kept beards. The Vigla marched us over and exchanged some sharp words with Rolf, who nodded, and then the Vigla left while one of the Varangians slipped inside the door. "We are lucky. The commander is in the hall today. If he was not, we might have waited for days. Word has been sent to seek an audience," Rolf said with a smile. "Well, ask the guard if we can wait inside at least," said Harald, because he, like the rest of us, was sweltering in the southern heat. "I speak your language, boy, and you can wait outside with me," growled the guardsman, his words familiar, but his accent strange. Harald stiffened, and I felt my heart hammer in my chest, praying he would control himself at the insult. But my fears were short-lived, as he managed to bite his tongue, and merely nod politely. Well, we stood around outside for quite some time, making what use of the shade of a large, broad-leafed tree we could. Eventually the doors opened, and a small party of finely dressed men appeared. The man at their head, a Greek, in gold-trimmed clothes, clean-shaven and beautifully manicured, looked at us with interest, eyeing us as they passed. Harald and I stared right back at them in confusion. These were not the first we had seen of the ruling class of the Greeks. Behind them, one of the Varangian guards motioned to us to come to the now open gate and allowed us through. An old warrior met us inside the gate, strongly built and plainly dressed. His hair was grey, like a stormy sky, but his eyes were still sharp, and his exposed arms muscular and tanned. "I'm here to meet the commander," said Harald in a clipped tone. "So I hear. Follow me," the warrior motioned. Harald looked aside at Afra and Rolf. "Wait for us here. I will not be long." Afra sighed, and Rolf nodded nonchalantly. He was much more used to the heat. We walked out of the gateway and past a door on each side before exiting into a shaded colonnade surrounding a large, dirt-surfaced training yard. "What is this place?" Harald asked, looking around. "This is the barracks of the executors," the old warrior replied. "The old cavalry guard of the emperors." "And where are the executors?" Harald asked. The guardsman's shoulders rose and fell in a contemptuous shrug. "They fell from favour, and we replaced them. Their remnants were sent to Italy. Now we call their barracks and hall our home." "Fell from favour?" I asked, curious. "Yes, we proved better at their job than they were. More ferocious, more trustworthy. They were rotten to the core, centuries of favouritism and nepotism hollowing them out, until they were just bright clothes on slow horses, beautiful in ceremonies, but quite useless as guards, and as likely to sell the Emperor as to protect him. We were reaching the other end of the long training ground now, and the guardsman headed for a door, opening it and leading us inside to a small entrance hall and a stairway, which he climbed. On the balcony at the top he opened a final door and walked through into what looked like the quarters of a clerk or officer. He walked around to the far side of a table spread with parchments and letters, and sat down. "Well, my name is Balfour. Tell me, why do you wish to join the guard?" Harald stumbled momentarily as he suddenly realized the old warrior was the commander. I almost laughed, but restrained myself to a sly smile as Harald took the only chair opposite the older man. "I've heard men say it is the greatest fighting company in the world, and I wish to learn, prove myself as worthy," Harald finally replied. Balfour smiled softly. "And why should I take you? This may indeed be the greatest fighting company in the world, but I keep it that way by only taking the best. Why would I take you and your men?" "We are battle-tested, all of us. I fought for years in the service of Prince Yaroslav, these men with me. Harald struggled to continue without telling the commander who we were. "You fought Poles in the Red Cities and then the Pechenegs. Quite the victory that was, or so I hear," said Balfour with a stern gaze as Harald grimaced. "You know who I am?" he said with a disappointed air. "Of course." "How did you know?" Balfour snorted. "It is my job to know any potential enemies of the Empire and who serves them. Yaroslav certainly is a potential enemy, and I know of only one company of Northmen recently in his service who might be looking for silver elsewhere." "Well, then you know my reputation and my worth," said Harald proudly. "And I know you disobeyed your prince and murdered a guest on the docks in front of a royal party," said Balfour with an accusing stare. Harald slumped in his chair slightly. "How can I trust a man like that?" Harald did not immediately answer, and the commander stood and tapped his hand on the table. "Let me tell you why the Varangians are trusted to be the Emperor's inner guardians. It is because we hold to our oaths with the utmost ferocity. We cannot be bought, we cannot be swayed, we cannot be seduced or distracted. We are the Emperor's personal warriors, resolute as iron, and every man in this company would die before he would be shamed with breaking faith. It is all we have, that faith. The moment one of us breaks it, we will be cast out and replaced like the executors before us." He stared harshly at Harald. "So why would I risk a reckless young prince who just sees this as a step on the path to his crown, and might break that faith for a petty blood feud?" Harald slammed to his feet. "It was not some petty blood feud," he spat. "That was my brother's murderer, my king's murderer. Wouldn't you want your men to have that dedication to justice? If the Emperor was slain, would you not rest easy, knowing I would avenge him on his enemies, no matter the cost?" Balfour met Harald's anger without flinching. "No," he replied calmly. Harald was taken aback. "No?" "No. Harald, our oath is to the throne and whoever sits on it. We preserve the Empire and its current ruler at all costs. We do not embark on crusades of revenge that would only weaken the palace. We guard the institution and the embodiment of royalty who leads it. We do not engage in blood feuds and vengeance." Harald deflated slightly and sat down again. "Then why bring me in here just to refuse me?" Balfour was silent for a moment. "Because I am not refusing you. It is not my decision. The Akalu and has decided you will be admitted." Harald looked up again, his hope reignited. "The Akaluthos? Who's that?" "The commander of the Varangians." "But I thought you were the commander." "No, not entirely. I am the leader. I train the men, discipline them, and lead them in battle. But it is the Akaluthos who gives me my commands. It is a position only a citizen hand-picked by the Emperor can occupy. He was here meeting with me when you arrived. You saw him leave. He has commanded me to take you into our service. So I shall, even if I do not like it. That is the meaning of service." Balfra looked at Harald without a trace of empathy, and his presence and command were intimidating even to me. "I fear you may be too arrogant, too self-involved, and too ambitious to be a good member of this guard. We serve. The guard obeys." He tapped the table for emphasis. "We may grow rich, we may even become powerful, but in return we serve. And we willingly give our blood and our lives for something greater than ourselves. Tell me, Prince Harald of Norway, do you believe in anything greater than yourself?" Harald sat through the admonishment, grating his teeth, but he nodded. "Two things, my brother's legacy and the Lord." Balfra tilted his head. "It is a start, but you will earn respect for this unit and the Empire before I give you authority. The guard will not be your plaything or your vessel for self-aggrandizement." Harald looked away, barely able to contain his anger at being spoken to this way. "You will learn to take criticism first of all, and show discipline. Stand up," he barked. Harald pushed himself to his feet just quickly enough to avoid being insolent, and I squirmed in discomfort behind him, knowing just how badly he would take all of this, but struggling to disagree with the commander. Who really would want Harald as a subordinate? He knew no limit, accepted no ultimate authority. Well, he wouldn't have been a great man if he did. Harald was an imposing presence, even at 19 years, as he was then. But standing there, face to face, Balfra dominated him. His power, authority, and righteous anger filled the room, and I could see easily how he had risen to be the commander of the famed Varangians. Any lesser man than Harald would have crumbled in the intensity and power of that disapproval. For Harald, it was merely fuel for his fire of resentment. Balfra took a moment staring into Harald's taut face, and then he returned to his chair. "You and your men will be split up, spread among 2 or 3 of the weaker." Harald huffed and looked down to protest, but the look the commander gave him showed none would be heard. "You said you wished to learn, so first you will learn humility and service. I will not put your men into a single bandon and command them as a petty fiefdom, undermining the company I have spent my entire life building. When you prove yourself, I may give you a flag." "A flag?" asked Harald in a husky, pained tone. Balfra sighed. "There are 30 banda in the guard, in theory, each of 200 men. Each bandon has a commander, the Combs, and a flag-bearer to accompany him and be his second. The flag is the standard of each bandon, and must be protected at the cost of everything except the Emperor's own safety. Being given a flag is the mark of a new Combs, usually after years of good and faithful service to the throne." Harald's eyes opened. "There are 6,000 men in the guard? This barracks is far too small for that." "No, there have not been 6,000 men in the guard since before I joined in the time of Emperor Basil. I have 17 banda, and many are under strength. We can put 2,000 men in the field, at most, leaving the bare minimum to guard the palace." Balfra looked at Harald with a conciliatory softening of his features. "Your men are most welcome, Prince Harald, even if your ambition is not. These are difficult times, and you will face many difficult fights." "We live for difficult fights," said Harald proudly. "Then I hope you will prove my doubts were wrong." Harald said nothing, and Balfra pulled out a sheet of parchment and pushed it across the table. "I will need the names of every single one of your men. We will accept only those who were born in the northern lands, are well-equipped, have battle experience, and are in full health. Every man who follows me is worthy. I do not allow those who are not." Balfra was unmoved and tapped the blank sheet. "I still need their names, and each will need his joining fee." Harald started. "His what?" Balfra looked up, confused. "Nobody told you." "That there is a fee to join. We join to be paid." "And you will be, handsomely. 40 gold solidi per year." "And the joining fee?" 10 pounds of gold per man." 10? Harald exclaimed in outrage. "I have 130 men. That's £1,300 of gold, he said in shock. We don't have that. We accept the equivalent in silver, said Balfra with a shrug. So, £18,000 of silver. Harald looked at me in horror. We don't have that much either. I shook my head. 10,000, maybe. Harald, what madness is this? I thought you were warriors, but you buy your place in the guard? And I thought you were famous mercenaries who would be rich in silver and gold. We only want the best, and the best mercenaries are rich men. But you do not have to pay the whole sum up front. You can pay some, and then owe the treasury the rest, to be deducted from your earnings and share of any loot until the debt is settled. That would take... Harald paused and looked at me for help. I was always better with numbers. About a decade of pay, I said, and my voice fell. It is nothing like a decade in practice, said Balfra. On your pay alone, yes, but you are going into the combat units, not the palace guard, and you will have the opportunity for plunder and bonuses as well as imperial gifts for service. Most men pay back the fee within 3 to 5 years, depending on how much we campaign. So you make men into slaves with this debt, Harald said with barely concealed contempt. No, we make them into loyal soldiers. It means no one joins the guard on a whim, or only intending to serve a few seasons, said Balfra firmly. Now do you wish to join or not? Because it will cause me no pain if you decide to leave. Regardless, my time is short. Harald swore under his breath and nodded sharply. We wish to join. Good. Then go and get a list of your men and... The commander looked at me earnestly. And what was it you can gather, £10,000 of silver? About that, I said with a sigh. Good. I would sell your ships too. You will get good money for them, and the docking fees will eat their value within months. There are always merchants looking for good ships. You will get a fair price. The commander smiled at me hungrily. You can add it to your payment. Chapter 3. An empire of thieves! Harald raged as we walked back across the large square outside the Hagia Sophia. I said nothing. Harald had to let out his pent-up anger, or he would likely kill someone. And the things he said to me, the way he... Harald bit his lip. Afra and Rolf had not been there, and he did not need to relate to them his humiliation. £10,000 of silver, he muttered. All we ever earned from Yaroslav, gone? It is a shocking amount, and we will still be in debt for years, years. I came here to be paid, not to provide money to the Empire. It is a clever system, you have to admit, I replied, trying to be soothing, but not achieving any part of it. Harald continued to simmer and rage as we made our way back down to the harbour. Eventually, we reached the harbour and handed the sealed token Balfra had given to us to the guard on the gate, who barely looked at it before waving us through. We went to the shipyard and found the supervisor, a middle-aged Greek official with a sharp eye and a sharper mind. You can say many things about the Greeks, and I will, but many of them are ruthless in both their intelligence and their competence. I wish to sell one of my ships and keep the other here for my own use, if I require it later, said Harald through Rolf. The Greek looked at our ships, which were fine Norse longships, but of less use in the waters of the Empire. I will give you no silver for it, but for the giving of one, I will store the other in the yard for 3 years free of charge, and consider it a fair bargain. Harald grimaced. It costs 1/3 of the value of a ship every year, just to dock it? The Greek smiled and shrugged, casting a gaze and a sweep of his hand around the compact harbour. There are many ships wishing for space, and little space itself. Space is worth more than ships, especially ships such as these. If it was a pair of good Roman, I would give you silver, or 5 years in the sheds for one of them. And if it is in the yard, how long between me asking for it and it being ready to sail away? A day, no more, said the man with a curious smile. Perhaps you are thinking of a situation where you need it more immediately. Harald looked at me and then nodded curtly. I am. Only 1 year on a launching slipway. 1 year? The man shrugged again. Launching space is very valuable. Harald shook his head and looked around the harbour again. Draw it up on the shore over there, facing the water, where those racks are. We are experienced with launching the ship. We will do it ourselves when needed. The shipyard master scrunched his eyebrows and looked at the sliver of empty space outside the yard, where racks of drying equipment and sails were sitting. It will not be under cover. It will swell and warp in the rain and sun. We will come and tend to it occasionally, and launch it to wet it. It will survive 3 winters. The man grunted to make it clear he did not agree, but nodded his head in acceptance. As you say. 3 years on the shore, but if it sinks when you launch, I take no responsibility. Harald stuck out his arm to seal the agreement, but the Greek looked perplexed until Rolf explained. It turns out the Greeks do not grasp arms to seal their words the way we do. Instead, the official wrote the promise down on parchment and stamped a wax disc with his large gold ring. Bah! The perfidious Greeks require such things to hold their words, while we require only the memory of them being spoken. It is one of the many ways I believe we... There are many others where I learned that we are not. Well, we gathered our accumulated wealth from the ships, all our bounty from Yaroslav's service. It was a sad proceeding. The men added what they could spare, pulling pouches from belts and rings from arms, until we had gathered together the full 10,000 pounds of silver, or near enough. It left us a little for whatever else we needed, because I did not know if the palace would provide for everything. When we had all made our way back up to the barracks, we were allowed through with escorts from the Vigla and the Varangians, 100 men in full armour, with axes and shields in hand. I suspect it was a typical precaution. They could not allow the chance that we were part of some plot against the Emperor. They looked far better than us, I admit, in their superb armour and glorious cloaks, helmets shining in the sun. But they were not just ceremonial seat-warmers either, you could tell. Their weapons bore the marks and repairs of battle, their faces and hands, too. They regarded us with disdain, but not a hint of fear. They had total confidence in their ability to slaughter us if we turned out to be false. We were taken through into the training square of the barracks, told to leave our weapons and equipment along one side, and then the Varangians lined the columned portico while we stood in a loose huddle and waited. Harald looked at the perfectly arrayed Varangians around the square, and then at us, and he sneered in distaste, barking at men to array themselves in ranks and stand up like soldiers. Well, we had done some ceremonial duties in Kyiv, and we did not array ourselves perfectly, but we managed to look less slovenly at least. Shortly after Harald had finished his embarrassed fussing over our formation, Balfra arrived with 6 more men in tow, 3 armed and armoured, 3 in normal clothes, one clutching a small writing tablet. He stepped out onto the dirt and gazed over our ranks with displeasure. "The list," he said, holding out his hand, and I went forwards at a trot to hand it to him. He squinted at my barely legible scrawlings in annoyance, and handed the list to the man with the writing tablet. "I hope your men can fight better than they can stand still or write," he said to Harald. "As well as any man," Harald replied proudly. "Any man? I have no room for boasting here. Let's find out." He turned to the closest of the Varangians. "Sweyn, practice swords." "What will be proven with wooden swords?" asked Harald. Balfra smiled. "This isn't an army barracks. We don't practice with wood." The man called Sweyn came back from a side room with a pair of old swords. "We just take a little of the edge off old steel," said Balfra. Sweyn walked along our ranks, assessing us. A warrior called Rurik. Harald smiled softly. Rurik was one of the blood-marked. Those had been with us since Stiklestad. He was one of our best. Rurik looked at the weapon emotionlessly, weighing it and shifting his grip until he was comfortable. Sweyn beckoned him out into the open space beside our men, who backed away and formed a loose semicircle around the 2 combatants. Sweyn stood, sword resting on his shoulder, watching Rurik, looking completely at ease. Rurik was perhaps unnerved by his supposed opponent's lack of action, or even preparation to fight. He got into a fighting stance, but then looked around at Harald for reassurance before he attacked a member of the palace guard. Harald gestured at him angrily to begin, and Rurik shrugged and turned again to face his motionless opponent before starting forwards to make a half-hearted attack. That was a terrible mistake. I felt for him. It was extremely hard for him to commit fully to attacking this man who did not even look ready to fight in such strange circumstances with no preparation. Rurik might have been a terrible foe in battle, but there was no spirit of war in him as he lunged forwards and threw a flat cart at Svein's stomach, and was too slow. But there was no spirit of war in him as he lunged forwards and threw a flat cart at Svein's stomach, and it was too slow, too easy to see coming. Svein brought his sword down off his shoulder in a flash, retreating his left leg and slamming Rurik's blade down into the dirt. Then he snapped his sword hand back up to strike Rurik in the forehead with a crunching blow with the pommel. Rurik grunted and fell back, going down like a felled tree. There was a sharp intake of breath and muttered complaints among our men. It felt dishonourable, and I wondered if the blow might have been fatal. Svein returned his sword to his shoulder and looked across at Balfr, as expressionless as before. "It is a shame your man is finished so easily. Is that what I can expect from all of you?" said the commander, looking at Harald. But Harald was not looking back at him, and the corner of his mouth curled. "I don't think Rurik agrees with you." We all followed the commander's gaze around, and I saw Rurik levering himself unsteadily to his feet, shaking his head, one hand held to the side of it, blood appearing in a thin trail down his temple. He squeezed his eyes open and shut a few times, and then fixed his gaze on Svein, and there was death in his eyes. He bent down to pick up his sword, and without any words being spoken or permission being given, he attacked again. This time he was striking to kill, and Svein parried a vicious lunge at his groin before ducking a cut that would have separated his head from his shoulders, blunt edge or not. Svein countered with a swing to buy himself space, and their blades met and rang like a hammer on anvil. It would ruin it in an instant. But with no shields and blunt weapons, the two men hacked and stabbed at each other in an extraordinary whirl of violence, both taking thumping blows to their mail, and Svein a nasty cut to his chin from a slash he could not quite avoid. But for everything Rurik threw at him, Svein was a match. As the Norwegian tired, Svein stepped into a cut rather than stepping back, and with his mailed arm deflected the blade like he would with a shield, wearing the painful blow to surprise his enemy and get close enough to deliver a vicious stab to the belly that folded Rurik in half. With a properly tipped sword, the blow might have gone through the armour. It was quite beautifully done. Despite his mail and the tipless sword, Rurik had the wind knocked out of him, and he went down again, wheezing and croaking. Svein, panting and sweating, stepped back and nodded to Balfr, who nodded thoughtfully. "Well, a fine performance, even if ultimately futile." "He isn't finished," grated Harald with a dark expression, staring at Rurik, loud enough for the humbled, kneeling warrior to hear. Rurik raised his face, pain creasing his features, breath coming in short gasps, and blood running down the left side of his face. "He isn't finished," said Harald more loudly, hands falling to his side and stepping forwards, eyes blazing, as he ignored the commander and stared at his fallen warrior. "Stand up, Rurik, and show them who we are. We are the ones who survived the Black Marsh, who broke the Persian eggs. We are strongest when our enemies think us defeated. Stand." Rurik's face tensed, and he nodded. His cheeks went red with the effort of standing, still gasping for air into his tortured lungs. But he got to one knee, and then levered himself to his feet with his sword, back uncurling as he finally stretched out to his full height. And Svein looked on in surprise, emotion finally cracking his stoic features. Harald